Yeah, this first ad was sent by Zach Wright. It's for a 64 Jazzmaster. That is.
It's not for a 64 Jazzmaster. It's for a gosh dang tragedy. It's what it is.
No, it's for a Fender 1963.
It's for a gosh dang crime, Steve.
Is it a crime?
It's a crime.
All right.
Did a crime go? I thought I heard a crime go. That's a joke from another podcast.
Yeah, I don't know what joke that
very few people will get. I thought I heard a crime go.
What podcast is that from?
I'm not even going to say at this point. I'm just going to leave it out there.
All right. He says, I have to call this this out as a vintage guitar lover. This makes me sick. This guy bought a Mint 64 Jazzmaster last year and now has destroyed it to sell for parts. This is shameful to do. Destroying history for profit is not okay.
At what point does a guitar become history?
I don't know. I think 63 Jazzmaster's pretty close.
Oh, I'm saying that's squarely into guitar history. But I'm saying, what's the cutoff date for parting out a guitar that isn't history? Because you can part out an 80s guitar, and I don't feel like that's history, depending on the guitar.
I think it really comes down to a sense of. I think you have to have a sense of history.
Well, I think the issue here is it greater than the sum of its parts.
Well, that's one of the things I think is kind of interesting here is you look at it and this guy's selling the body for like $3,000,
yeah,
the neck for a little, $3,000.
I'm not talking about the dollar value. I'm talking about the intrinsic value.
But I'm saying like, sure, from intrinsic value, I think it just depends on if it has. I think whether or not it's historic is completely up to perspective, and I realize like I almost feel like saying like, well, you'll know it's historic because it'll just be historic. But what I mean by that is like you said, like if you part something out from the 80s, it's like whatever. But at the same time, like I have my 80s Fender Japanese is a Fender Contemporary Standard Stratocaster. So it does not have the original locking string trees or the original tremolo on it. Vibrato, whatever.
I think you mean tremolo.
Tremolo, right. My original trololo.
Yeah, your trololo.
It doesn't have those parts. And probably at the time, the person who took all that stuff off was just like, oh, I want a vintage style trem, whatever. It's cool. But like now from the point, 30 years later, I'm like, man, I wish I had all that original weird 80s stuff on it.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's something to be said for having a guitar that has all its parts.
Yeah,
but
the flip side of that is if you bought like an.
But then you could buy those parts from Gary's Gear Outlet, who's selling this stuff.
Right. Well, sure. And the flip side of that is if it was just like in 1987 Fender American Standard or whatever year they started making that guitar, 87, 88, somewhere around there, 89 maybe. They made that guitar exactly the same for 20 years.
Right.
So who cares?
Right.
Right. Now, once you get back to a certain point, yeah, there's kind of, you couldn't make the same argument for like a 70s Strat. I think you could make the argument for like an 80s, like early 80s Dan Smith Stratocaster. So if somebody took like are you familiar with the model called the Strat?
Right.
Or like an early 80s American Elite Stratocaster. If you parted that out, I think you'd get some side eye and some cockeyed, some crooked.
Do you think this ad is defendable from the direction that someone could use these parts to complete the originality of another a 64 Jazzmaster that they have?
Sure. I mean, that's probably the market that this guy's going for, but I think the outrage here is coming from the assumption that this guy bought this guitar in minty fresh condition, either with the intention
of flipping it,
of
flipping the parts,
of trying to flip parts, or just under the mentality of like, oh, I'm going like, or he got to a point where he's like, oh, I need to make some money. I'm going to do this thing.
Well, what's the value of, because he's not including the pickups.
Right. So,
or the pick guard.
So the question in turn could be like, I wonder if he already had a 63 Jazzmaster that
64
or 64 Jazzmaster.
Get your year right.
Well,
please.
the parts.
We are supposed to be guitar experts.
Well,
and you just
here's
on the
here's
year.
the thing: is
we
like,
should be picking
shut
this apart.
up.
Should be picking this apart based on the month and week.
Well, we don't have
made.
access to that information.
I'm just joking. I don't
care. The ads all say 63. The
Right.
caption says 60.
That's
64.
true. That is true.
So
good point.
But my bigger point here being that maybe he took the parts that he needed to restore a guitar that he had,
or maybe he literally bought this and it didn't have the pick guard or pickups. This is all it came with.
Well, I think right. So I guess
maybe his mentality was like, oh, I'm gonna buy this. I got a good deal on it. I'm gonna track down pick guard and pickups, and then he was just one day like, meh, I'm not gonna find them. I don't want to do the work. I'm just gonna sell the parts.
Right.
I don't know. The more I think, when I first saw this ad, I was offended by the thought of taking apart a 64 Jazzmaster. But the more I think about it, the more I'm like, meh. It's not like someone who's gonna buy that Jazzmaster neck for $2,600 and slap it onto, some crappy body. Like, people who are going to be spending that money and buying this, vintage of guitar part is going to be using it to complete
this
like
guy
a legitimate project.
At this point, it looks like potentially the tuner's sold because I can't find them on Reverb.
Yeah. $350 for tuners, man. I know that they're the originals, but I feel like I would not make that the thing that I'd be obsessed over.
He says that he's also on the body, including the shielding and strap buttons as well.
Right.
That makes it.
So he's not going to strip
desirable.
the shielding out of the body before he sells it to you. That's very kind of him.
Well, I think the shielding is actually like some kind of drop in because it's not.
Oh, is it?
It's not in the picture.
I thought it was kind of coppery looking in that picture.
So that's what.
Oh yeah, weird. It is a drop-in plate. That's bizarre. I've never seen that before. Steve just showed me on.
But yeah, there's not really any discussion on here about how he came across this. Just that it's an original, unmolested Jazzmaster body with original finish.
Well, now he's gone and molested it, hasn't
vibrant
he?
and bright. And those are the only two things listed on his store. So, there's no other point of reference to like. Maybe the pickup and pickguard were the first thing sold before somebody found it and started sharing it around.
Or maybe he had an even better Jazzmaster that he wanted to put those pickups and pickguard onto. And this is the result of him tracking down parts and spending a lot of money to do it.
Yeah.
He's got to sell off a guitar that he bought.
Anyways, so you think like, okay, say you bought a intact, 63 whatever from Fender, you're like just like yeah sure, like whatever, just part it out. What do you think if he actually?
If I spent that kind of money, I wouldn't be like, oh yeah, just whatever, let's part it out. I'll say that right now.
Well, what would you say? Like, okay, say you bought it for, I don't know, $8,000, like some vintage guitar, and you were like, oh, $8,000, and you get it, and you start looking at it, and you realize like, okay, say it's Fender, so say it's like something about it's weird. I don't know, like maybe, the guy who sold it to you thought it was like a 66, so it was like a little less, but turns out it's like a 64, so it's worth more. I don't know if that's a thing,
right?
But let's pretend it's a thing. And so you're like, oh man, these are all 64 parts, not 66. This thing's worth like $20,000, not $8,000, but it's only worth that in parts. I don't know. That seems weird.
Yeah.
I don't know. So in some situation where like you could get, say, instead of getting, $10,000, you could get $12,000 if you sold parts instead of selling the whole thing.
Sure.
Like, is that a thing you think you would be like, oh yeah, I'm going to do this? Or would you just be like, I'm just going to be happy with a $2,000 profit instead of a $4,000 profit?
Man, if I could make a $4,000 profit, I'd probably go for the $4,000 profit.
So it's like, historical significance of the instrument be damned. You're gonna make that extra $2,000.
Yeah, I mean, I can have a lot of fun with $2,000. I can pay a lot of bills. That's part of a mortgage payment or something right there.
Right. So I guess
that down payment on a car.
that's kind of like blends into our first topic.
Yeah, it does. Well, that's how we planned this episode, Steve, is the first ad rolling into the first topic.
Okay.
Remember when we discussed that and we agreed upon it?